Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast, 5 Ways to Help Control Common Area Maintenance, CAM Costs. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen to get us started.
Great. So my name is Stephen Bacchetti. I'm a partner at Moss Adams, and I lead our real estate and construction advisory team. And I will pass it over to Isabella for a quick introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Isabella Risucci. I'm a senior manager here at Moss, and I head up our real estate advisory group. My background, why am I talking about CAM audits today? I was a property manager in downtown San Francisco for a long time. So I have performed CAM audits as a landlord going through them. And now on the other side, we help landlords establish strong leases and also helping tenants kind of navigate CAM audits. So I'm excited to be speaking with you today. I'll pass it back over to Steve just to talk a little bit more about our group, and then we'll go ahead and get started today.
So our real estate and construction advisory team, we have a bunch of people that are, like Isabel said, we're ex-property managers, ex-project construction managers, project engineers. So we perform about 100 contract audits per year, whether it's related to real estate and or construction. In addition, we perform probably about 50 process reviews, whether it's related to construction and or real estate. And we find that the holistic approach to these types of projects is critical because a lot of organizations have both construction and real estate considerations when they're performing strategic planning around where their capital program or real estate program is going. So as you know, there's been a lot of kind of discussions on utilization in terms of kind of office, for example. So we've seen a lot of uptick in terms of clients saying we have a big footprint within the office program. We have capital program plans to expand or to delay. And we also have a lot of footprints of office leasing, for example, that we need to figure out how to right size it given the kind of the new hybrid work environment, et cetera. So from these processes, we've done a lot of extensive work with various programs, understanding kind of what their processes are, how they're managing their leases. And CAM audits have come up quite a bit from both an owner perspective and from a landlord perspective and a lessee perspective. And what we're hoping for today's call is really to kind of share some best practices, what we're seeing for areas for improvement within these contracts to improve transparency amongst both stakeholders and to provide kind of the best practices in terms of how to manage your program as a whole. So we hope it's good content, and the intent of this is to really support all the attendees here. So if you have any questions throughout this webinar, just shoot it in the message and we'll get to as many as we can. If not, we'll follow up after the webinar and get back to you shortly. And with that, I will pass it over to Isabella.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so let's talk about what is a CAM audit. So common area maintenance, it could be called a lease audit. Some people refer to them as operating expenses. What is that? So if you lease space in an office building, an office park, just a standalone building, a retail space, you will likely be paying, in addition to rent, operating expenses. These are costs for operating the building, for plumbing, for security, for landscaping, right? Helping make where your space is nice and keeping it up to date, paying for staff, engineering, things like that. And so your share of those expenses is typically your pro rata share. It's based on how much square footage you lease compared to the overall building square footage. So you pay this. Typically, how it works is your landlord will have a new budget for the year. Based on your pro rata share, you'll pay estimates throughout the year. And in Q1 the following year, there's a reconciliation once all actual costs are known and the books for the prior year are closed. And so based on the estimates that you've paid, you will either get a credit back, or you will likely get a bill for additional operating expenses. And we know that sometimes that can be shocking if you owe a lot more, or, it's always great when you get money back, but as we know, costs are rising everywhere. And so I think the trend for the last few years is that people aren't really getting as much money back. So a CAM audit is the opportunity that a tenant has to review the calculations that go into that reconciliation. So it's reviewing, we want to get copies of the books. We want to see what was charged to us. We want to understand, we want to look at invoices, making sure that you're being charged your fair share, especially if you lease an entire building, or if you're in a high rise and you have multiple floors, your proportionate share could be almost half of a building. So there could be significant expenses that you're currently incurring. Typically in every lease, there's a section about what this looks like. It'll talk about what is an operating expense, what's in, what's out, and what are your rights for conducting that audit and how the parties will conduct themselves. And so obviously audits no one likes to be audited. It's difficult for both parties sometimes. And so having the most clear lease language possible to make that process as painless as possible and easy is really what we want to try and recommend. It's putting in strong controls in leases so that if an audit comes about, it's very clear how it's to be performed, what is in, what is out, and that's kind of what we're going to hop in today. I'll go ahead and pass this back to Steve.
Great. So when we do the CAM contract audits, the first step of the process is we look at what the contract says. That's really guiding what's an allowable and unallowable expense. What we are finding in a lot of cases is there is vague language within what is an allowable charge to pass on or charge to a lessee. And that is creating areas where it's gray and it's unclear for both sides, whether it's the owner or the lessee. So what are some of the areas that we see as common findings or common areas that could be improved to both protect the owner and kind of clarify from a transparency standpoint to the lessee? Some of the major ones we see are administrative costs and accounting fees, for example. So administrative costs, we'll see many contracts that just say, hey, administrative costs are an allowable cost, and that's it. It doesn't define it. So if you have a lessee that's looking to kind of proactively manage costs or have questions, that can be an area where they have questions about or potentially have disputes with. So what we'd recommend for administrative costs is really defining what is an administrative cost, who are the types of personnel that can charge to it, what are the overhead considerations that would be allowable. If it is software, what is the software, what is the basis of allocation? If it is IT, what's an allowable IT charge? Is it all the whole IT corporate allocation, or is it specific people and specific types of equipment? And we find by defining it, again, protects both the owner from potential disputes with the lessee, and then for the lessee, it's a really good understanding of what is being included within it, etc. Same concept with accounting fees. We'll see various contracts that are very unclear in this, which creates potential areas for disputes from a lessee standpoint. So from an owner perspective and a lessee, when you go into these contracts or leases, it's important to have these discussions up front of saying, okay, what would be considered an accounting fee? What types of charges would that be? Like, when would these types of charges occur? Are there caps? Are there considerations of the various vendors that may be included within this? And I find the upfront proactiveness discussions around these areas help the lessee understand what the costs are going to be and kind of have a good anticipation of what the costs are going to be for the year. And then for the landlord, it's an area that if it is clarified and there's a good understanding from the lessee, it's going to build a relationship, and it's going to prevent potential risks where a lessee potentially comes back saying, hey, that charge is not allowable per the contract, or it's unclear and we're going to have a dispute on it. Next slide, please. Okay, due diligence and benchmarking clauses. So this is another area where you can kind of factor it in. As many of you know, costs are not decreasing, they're increasing. There's a lot more scrutiny from a lessee standpoint to understand, are the costs being charged to me within these CAM reconciliations? Are they compliant? Are they getting excessive? How do we reduce costs? So from an owner perspective, we believe that it's a best practice to have a routine bidding out of vendors, making sure that it's competitive, that you can demonstrate the cost competitiveness to the lessees. If there are self-perform elements, which we often see that maybe the owner's taking on specific types of work that could be outsourced, that you have that benchmarking information available. This is going to do two things. One, it's going to demonstrate that you are competitive in the marketplace from a cost perspective. So that is going to translate to more favorable terms for the lessee, which is going to increase the relationship. And I think too, just having that routine understanding of, hey, these are the key vendors. This is how we are managing performance within these contracts. This is how we are demonstrating the value to our lessees. It's going to improve the relationship and decrease the cost for the lessee in terms of making sure that they know they have a fair value, which is going to increase the retention or potentially their duration that they are within lease. So it's kind of a win-win situation from managing the property, making sure you guys have the best vendor performance on the property, in addition to making sure that the lessee understands that they're getting a really good deal in terms of qualified vendors at a competitive price. So it's going to make the duration of them wanting to stay on the property longer. And then, Isabella, I'll pass it back over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so let's talk about capital expenditures and amortization definitions. So in addition to like traditional operating expenses, things that the landlord has to pay monthly for taking care of the building, some capital expenditures are also pass-throughable to tenants. Usually if there's cost savings to be had, so if the useful life of the boilers of the building has run its course, you're going to perform a replacement, and in doing so, you're putting in the most energy efficient boilers possible. So over time, you spend a lot of money, but over time, you will potentially reduce the electricity costs of the building, which is a savings to the tenant. So something like that is a typical capital expenditure that you would pass through your tenants. But these are high cost items. So you don't just put your $500,000 you spent on 2 new boilers into one particular operating expense here. Rather, you amortize it across multiple years. And so the tenant is paying their portion of a smaller cost of that singular capital improvement. So there's a lot of questions about, well, what counts as pass-throughable? What doesn't count as pass-throughable? I've been on the landlord side where we're trying to decide, like, this maybe doesn't extend the life of the asset, but, to our tenants, it's important that we are green and we're going for LEED and Fitwell and other certifications. And so could this improvement, if it helps get savings in one way, it helps with tenants that need to meet certain requirements internally, like being a part of a green building. Could we maybe make this work? Could we maybe not make this work? But so I think typically when I've seen in leases is it says, capital expenditures that kind of extend the life of the building. And it's just not very clear. And I think that there can be a lot of questions about, well, how do we amortize it over 20 years because that's the useful life of what this piece of equipment should last for? Should we have an expedited amortization schedule? Why? And I think as landlord, it's important that we're able to answer those questions if tenants ask about it. And I think when it comes to putting together the lease language surrounding capital amortizations, it's important to ask, is this truly lessee lesser cost? What are we going to define as what those expenses are? Can we spell that out clearly in the lease? the useful life. Are we going off of industry standards, or can there be cases where we have an expedited useful amortization? And in what cases would that be acceptable, right? Can we put that into the lease and make it very clear, like, yes, we can do this and here's why? Are the costs either straight lined, or is it a declining balance method, right? So is it $100,000 split $10,000 for 10 years? Or is it, do we start with, okay, this year we'll start 30 to 20 to 10 to 5 for the rest? There are lots of reasons why a landlord may choose to do one or the other, but it's important to ask those questions when you're negotiating a lease, because that kind of decision can impact costs to you as a tenant. Talking about when amortization occurs, I know that when I was a landlord, we would not start anything until the equipment was put into service. So everything's done, hooked up, everything's paid. Okay, that particular month is going to be when we say we're going to start this amortization. Is it over the entire lease term? Is it a small portion of it? Depending on where tenants are at in their lease when they come on board, or when the actual work takes place, could be impactful. And then what accounting standards will be used. And I put this in here because, I think traditionally it's like GAAP, but is this an international company that uses a different accounting standard, but they have property here? Those types of little inputs, they kind of seem like smaller decisions, but they can overall impact what this calculation looks like. So they're just questions to ask. Moving on, so establishing expense caps and non-allowable charges. Usually there is a cap, I would say, in most leases that say year over year expenses can't go higher than 5%. And I think that that's important to have, just to control costs for both landlord and tenant, because if a new tenant moves in, any given expense year is going to suddenly become their base year. So if you have an incredibly high base year with lots of expenses, traditionally when reconciliation is occurring, you're looking at, here's what we spent this year minus that tenant's base year. Okay, here's what's left over. Do they owe or do they not? And so you want to make sure that every year your expenses aren't going crazy in 2021 and then back down super low in 2023, because then you're going to end up with fluctuations across tenants, and it can kind of get into a sticky situation where you're not perhaps collecting as much as you could be, or you're always giving credits. And so you want to sort of avoid that. And so caps can be a good way to sort of maintain that. I think there could be caps put in for utilities. And this is, of course, speaking to not tenant direct. If tenants have their own meters in their space for electricity, water, or gas, and they get their own bills, of course, that's 100% their cost. I'm speaking to electricity for the entire building. We know that rates, especially where I'm at in California, they can fluctuate heavily. So it's important to think about, okay, well, if in this year, like using me where I am as an example, we know PG&E's rates are going absolutely crazy. Landlords just get the bill, kind of hard to fight utilities. But if that makes your expenses go way up in utilities as a tenant, if there's a cap established to kind of protect against that, it could be beneficial. And then that also helps the landlord with not having a crazy high year that can come back to hurt them in a following year. And then, caps are obviously meant to be adjusted periodically. We really want to encourage landlords and tenants to have strong relationships. We want people to have leases where they're happy, they invest in these build outs. Landlords often invest in the same build outs. We want them to have good working relationships where they can have these types of conversations. It's something that could be revisited. We know that costs are changing. You shouldn't be locked into, if you have a 25-year lease, you shouldn't be locked into a cap in year one that is just not really helpful over 25 years. But it's having a clause in the lease that says this could be revisited periodically and, touched with an amendment to fix it. And again, just speaking to having that regular communication between parties can help ensure that everyone's aware of changes to operating expenses and then work together to manage costs effectively. Okay, great. And then so this is really the crux of what we wanted to talk about today. It's the right to audit clause. So an audit is happening. There are a lot of little tiny pieces that can make an audit either super stressless, let's just get it done, or make it really stressful. So I've seen landlords that have clauses that an audit can only be performed in person The books have to be reviewed in an office under review, and that makes things challenging when a lessee's accounting, who would maybe be performing the audit, or an outside firm if they hire them to perform the audit, is an in-state. And so then that's an additional cost to them. So, that's not something that's very flexible. It's things like that, to where we want to make sure that if an audit needs to happen, it's easy for everybody. So kind of running through these, you want to have good notice requirements. So when you get your reconciliation package, a lot of leases will say you have X amount of days to provide notice that you want to perform an audit, or else you lose the right to audit forever. There are some leases I've seen that don't have any kind of notice requirement, and a tenant at any time could look back at as many years in the past as they want. I think that there is a middle ground to be had there. I think just with how business goes, getting a reconciliation package over to accounting, over to people to review, 30 days isn't really long enough to evaluate if an audit should or shouldn't be performed. I would try and meet somewhere in the middle, but I also understand, from a landlord's perspective, 10 years down the road, you want to look back 10 years. I think that coming to a consensus about what does notice look like, and is it written, is it electronic, what counts? I think that that's important, because I've also seen disputes of, well, you emailed me and your lease actually says it has to be written notice mailed. And, people can kind of get down in the weeds on those details instead of kind of working together as a partnership. Timeline restrictions, I spoke about this a little bit, but it goes further. It's, okay, an audit has started. How long does a tenant have to complete the audit? Upon receipt, of course, of all the information that they need in order to complete that audit. We would say at least 90 days. It's a lot of back and forth. It could be potentially, we don't want someone to be auditing for 2 years, right? But again, that's just assuming we get all the documentation. I think at least 90 days is adequate. For remedies, what does it look like if money is found to be owed back to the tenant? Or if by some happening, maybe the tenant underpaid. Maybe that is also found to be. What does the remedy look like? Is it a credit to the tenant statement? Is it a check? Is it a reduction in the current estimates? Some people may just want to check, but for whatever reason, a landlord may not feel that that's the way they want to go. Make it clear. For facilitation, who's going to be performing the audit? Is it an outside firm? Are tenants allowed to perform the audit themselves? Just make that, if there should be a requirement, go ahead and define that in the lease. Make it really clear what needs to happen. Access, I talked about this before. Must it be performed in person? I think that for best practices to help all parties, being able to review things electronically is likely best. It's just we have the internet, we have secured portals. It's the fastest way to transmit information and get what we need to get finished. And then reporting requirements. So just talking about maybe incorporating routine reporting language to, if there's going to be high fluctuations, like where are things trending? So then throughout the year. So then when a tenant receives their package, they're not surprised at the number of if they owe money or if their credit's really high, and kind of like avoiding those questions, because all along, maybe they've seen reporting that shows, okay, this is anticipated, this makes sense. So it's kind of getting some questions out of the way throughout the year, which we think could potentially be helpful. All right. I am going to go ahead and pass it back over to Steve. I know we talked about a lot of information today. I want to be mindful of time. If you have questions, pop them in the chat. Like Steve said, we'll get to them when we can. But Steve?
All right. So we got quite a few questions. Again, just as Isabella said, please put them in there. We'll respond to all, but we'll kind of only be able to get to a few today. So yeah, ask your questions. Let's ask a pro. Let's get Isabella's take on all these questions. So the first one is, how often should you perform a CAM audit based off your experience? Is it every year? Is it every 10 years? What's kind of the recommendation?
Yep. If it was absolutely up to me, I would audit every year. And I say this as a landlord or former landlord, because every year is an opportunity for there to be an error. A lot of CAM reconciliations are performed in Excel. A lot of it requires manual review by the property management team, making sure there's 12 months of expenses for landscaping, security, things like that. And mistakes are likely just human error rather than something malicious going on. But it's important to just be open to people can make mistakes, but paying an outside firm money to perform an audit is obviously expensive. So I think depending on how long your lease is, I would say at least if you can't do every year, at least every 3 years. And and I say that especially maybe perhaps close to a lease renewal. So you can kind of pop under the hood and see, hey, how have things been going? Because if you find out that you've been overcharged a lot for the past few years, maybe that impacts how you want to negotiate your next lease. And maybe then that can help impact the type of language you want to incorporate into your lease extension around the operating expense process. So I would say if you can't do every year, at least every 3 years. And if at all, at least do it once in your lease term, just simply for the sake of if you're paying a lot of money, you should probably check to make sure that you're paying correctly. It's not as easy as, oh, this is my rent. Okay, I just have to pay that. It says it very clearly. There's a lot of ambiguity rather than just, okay, I got this, I'll pay this. I want to be mindful of time, but I can see a ton of questions. We'll follow up by email, but I know I need to pass it over to chat at this point. But we will follow up by email to all questions in the chat, so please keep them coming.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen and Isabel, for a great presentation today. And like Isabel said, if we didn't have time to answer your questions, I know we had quite a few coming through. We'll do our best to follow up with you after this webcast. We will follow up with each and every one of you. Here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. And just a final note, we will be sending out an email in the next 24 hours that will include the recording of this webcast and also the PowerPoint deck as well. We had quite a few questions coming in on that. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.